this episode, we are moving into a topic that often helps new security leaders feel less overwhelmed, because industry standards and frameworks give structure to a job that can otherwise seem endless and unclear. A security program can feel like a giant pile of policies, tools, risks, projects, meetings, and compliance demands unless there is some shared model for organizing all that work. Standards and frameworks help create that model. They give an organization a common language for talking about what good security should include, how responsibilities should be assigned, and where the most important gaps may still exist. For beginners, this matters because a mature security program is not built by guessing what to do next every week. It is built by following a coherent approach that connects business needs, governance, risk, controls, and continuous improvement. When an organization applies standards and frameworks well, security becomes more understandable, more repeatable, and far easier to explain to leadership, auditors, customers, and the teams expected to carry the program forward every day. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A helpful place to start is by understanding that standards and frameworks are related, but they are not exactly the same thing. A standard usually describes expected requirements or established practices that organizations can align to, often in a more formal or testable way. A framework is usually broader and more flexible, giving leaders a structured way to think about the parts of a security program and how those parts fit together. In practical terms, a standard often tells you what should exist or what should be true, while a framework helps you organize the overall program and decide how to improve it over time. Neither one is automatically a law, and neither one should be treated like a magic answer that removes the need for judgment. They are tools for structure and alignment. That distinction matters because many weak programs either treat frameworks like rigid checklists or treat standards like optional reading. Strong programs understand what role each one plays and use both in a way that fits the business rather than forcing the business to pretend it looks like a generic model on paper. Organizations use these models for several very practical reasons, and all of them point back to the need for consistency. A growing company may start with security decisions being made one project at a time, one exception at a time, or one incident at a time, but that becomes hard to sustain as the environment gets larger and more dependent on technology. Standards and frameworks help leaders stop reinventing the program every time a new issue appears. They create common expectations for risk management, access control, resilience, incident response, governance, and ongoing review. They also help different groups inside the company understand each other more easily. Security, information technology, audit, legal, operations, and executive leadership may all use different language unless there is a shared model tying the work together. This is one reason good frameworks are so valuable. They create a stable backbone for the program. Once that backbone exists, decisions become easier to compare, gaps become easier to explain, and the organization becomes less dependent on individual habit or memory to keep important security practices functioning properly. Several widely used models show how different standards and frameworks serve different purposes. The National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, cybersecurity framework is often used to help organizations organize security work around broad functions such as identifying assets, protecting systems, detecting events, responding to incidents, and recovering from disruption. International Organization for Standardization, ISO 27001, is often used when organizations want a more formal management system approach that connects governance, risk treatment, control selection, documentation, and continual improvement. Control objectives for information and related technology, COBIT, is often used when leaders want stronger alignment between governance, assurance, and the management of enterprise information and technology. Center for Internet Security, CIS, controls are often used when teams want a more direct and operational set of control-focused practices to guide implementation priorities. Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard, PCI DSS, is more narrowly connected to payment card data environments. but it is a useful example of how some standards apply because of a specific business activity rather than because they are meant to describe the whole security program. These models are not identical, and that difference is exactly why selection matters. One of the most important beginner lessons is that a framework is not the same thing as a regulation, a contract requirement, or an internal policy. A law tells an organization what it must do under a legal or regulatory obligation. A contract may define what the organization has promised to a customer, vendor, or partner. An internal policy tells employees what the organization expects them to do. A framework sits at a different level. It helps organize the security program so those other obligations can be managed more clearly and consistently. This matters because people often mix these layers together and then get confused about why the program feels messy. A company may have to comply with privacy law, meet customer expectations, and follow internal security policy, but it still needs a coherent model for governing the overall security effort. That is where standards and frameworks help most. They do not replace law or internal direction. They help the organization create a stable operating approach that makes those obligations easier to interpret, assign, monitor, and improve over time instead of handling each pressure point in isolation. Choosing a framework should begin with business context, not with popularity. A beginner may be tempted to ask which framework is best, but that question usually needs to be translated into a more useful one. Best for what kind of business, what kind of risk profile, what level of maturity, and what kind of stakeholder expectation. A heavily regulated financial firm, a healthcare provider, a small software company, and a manufacturing organization may all need strong security, but they may not benefit equally from the same starting model. A company seeking customer trust in formal audits may care about one kind of structure, while a company trying to improve internal discipline quickly may benefit from another approach. Good leaders therefore begin by asking what the organization is trying to achieve. Is it trying to mature governance, organize risk conversations, support certification, strengthen operational controls, respond to customer demands, or create a more credible management system for the future? Once that purpose is clear, selecting a framework becomes much more rational because the organization is no longer choosing a brand name. It is choosing a structure that fits real business needs. That business fit also includes maturity, because the right framework can be applied very poorly if the organization tries to do too much at once. A young or resource-constrained company may become discouraged if it selects a model that is sound in principle but far too heavy for its current staffing, governance, and process discipline. On the other hand, a larger organization may stay stuck if it chooses an approach that is too narrow to support executive oversight, third-party assurance, or broader governance needs. Good application therefore requires right sizing. The goal is not to shrink the framework until it becomes meaningless, but to sequence the work so the organization can make real progress. That may mean beginning with basic asset understanding, access governance, incident structure, and policy discipline before trying to perfect every part of documentation or every layer of measurement. Strong leaders understand that frameworks are most useful when they guide improvement in stages. The organization should feel challenged by the model, but not crushed by it. A program that cannot sustain its own approach will eventually drift into paper compliance and performative control language without meaningful security improvement underneath. Once a framework is selected, the next practical step is usually a current state assessment. This means looking at the organization as it actually operates today and comparing that reality against the model the framework provides. The point is not to embarrass the team or produce a giant list of everything that is missing. The point is to understand where the biggest and most meaningful gaps are. A useful assessment asks whether the organization has clear ownership, defined policies, working processes, appropriate controls, evidence of operation, and management visibility in the areas the framework considers important. It also asks whether those elements are merely written down or whether they are genuinely functioning in practice. This is where frameworks become powerful because they help leaders look at the program systematically instead of only through recent incidents or the loudest current concern. A good gap assessment creates a clearer map of where the program stands. That map then supports prioritization, budgeting, and sequencing because leaders can see which weaknesses are foundational, which are urgent, and which may reasonably wait until the organization has more capacity to address them well. Applying a framework effectively also means translating broad guidance into governance, ownership, and working process. A framework may describe the need for risk management, asset governance, incident response, or access control, but the framework itself does not run the program. People do. That means the organization has to assign responsibility, define who approves what, decide how evidence will be kept, and create routines that make the framework real in daily work. For example, if the chosen model emphasizes risk management, then someone must own the risk process, someone must approve risk acceptance, and leadership must know how risks are reported and reviewed over time. If the model emphasizes incident readiness, then the organization must decide who declares an incident, who coordinates response, who communicates with leadership, and how lessons learned will be captured afterward. This translation work is where many programs succeed or fail. Reading a framework and admiring its logic is not enough. The organization has to turn general guidance into actual operating discipline, and that requires management attention, cross-functional cooperation, and enough clarity that people know what is expected of them. Documentation often becomes part of this work, but it should be treated as support for the program rather than as the program itself. A weak implementation produces a large collection of policies and procedures that sound aligned to the framework but are rarely used to guide actual decisions. A stronger implementation uses documentation to clarify roles, define expectations, support consistency, and make it easier for employees and leaders to understand how the program is supposed to function. Good documentation should help answer practical questions. What process exists? Who owns it? What evidence shows it is operating? What happens when it fails or when an exception is needed? Framework-aligned documentation can be very valuable because it creates continuity when teams grow, when auditors ask questions, or when leadership changes. Even so, the true test is whether the documented process reflects reality. If a policy says access is reviewed quarterly, but no reliable review is happening, the framework has not actually been applied well. Mature programs always remember that written alignment means very little if operational alignment is missing. Measurement and reporting also become much stronger when tied to a recognized framework, because the organization gains a more stable view of what should be monitored and why. Without that structure, reporting often becomes a mix of whatever is easiest to count, whatever the latest audit requested, and whatever tool produced a dashboard most recently. A framework helps leaders step back and ask whether the program is being viewed across the right categories. Are governance responsibilities clear? Are important assets understood? Are protective controls functioning? Are detection and response capabilities maturing? Is recovery readiness improving? Are third-party risks being handled sensibly? Once those larger questions are visible, leadership can choose measures that support real oversight instead of just producing noise. This also improves communication with boards, executives, customers, and auditors because the program can be described in a more coherent way. Rather than explaining security as a series of disconnected tasks, leaders can show how monitoring and reporting fit inside a broader model of program health and risk management, which makes the entire effort easier to understand and defend. In practice, many organizations do not rely on only one model forever, and that is perfectly reasonable when done carefully. A company might use NIST as a broad organizing framework, draw operational control priorities from CIS controls, and use ISO 27001 concepts when building a formal management system or preparing for certification. Another organization may rely heavily on COBIT for governance alignment, while also mapping its technical controls to other models that fit day-to-day security work more directly. The important point is that combining models should reduce confusion, not increase it. If the organization adopts several frameworks without deciding how they relate to each other, the result can be duplicated effort, conflicting language, and teams that spend more time mapping control names than improving the environment. Strong leaders use integration thoughtfully. They build a crosswalk between models where needed, decide which one serves as the main organizing structure, and make sure employees are not being asked to satisfy 3 different vocabularies for what is essentially the same underlying control or process. Several common mistakes can make framework adoption weaker than it should be, and beginners benefit from recognizing them early. One mistake is adopting a model mainly because a customer asked about it. without deciding how it will actually guide the internal program. Another is treating framework alignment as a document writing exercise rather than an operating change effort. A third is trying to implement everything at once in a burst of enthusiasm that quickly turns into fatigue, missed deadlines, and growing skepticism from the teams expected to support the work. There is also the mistake of copying language from a framework into policy without translating it into roles, decisions, and workflows the organization can truly follow. Perhaps the most common problem, however, is checklist thinking. When teams focus only on whether a control box can be marked as present, they may miss whether the control is effective, understood, owned, and sustainable. Frameworks are not meant to encourage shallow completion. They are meant to encourage structured improvement, which is a much more demanding and much more valuable outcome than simply claiming alignment on paper. A practical example makes this much easier to picture. Imagine a mid-sized company that has grown quickly through acquisitions and now has inconsistent policies, uneven access practices, unclear incident roles, and scattered risk reporting. Leadership wants a more coherent security program but does not know where to begin. The company chooses NIST as the primary organizing model because leadership wants a clear and understandable structure that can be communicated across technical and non-technical teams. A gap assessment shows that asset understanding is weak, protective controls vary by business unit, and incident responsibilities are too informal. Rather than trying to fix everything at once, the company uses the framework to sequence its work. First, it clarifies ownership and asset visibility. Then it strengthens access governance and incident process. After that, it improves reporting and formalizes recurring reviews. Over time, the framework helps leadership explain progress, align projects to known gaps, and make budget decisions that feel connected to a larger strategy instead of to isolated requests. The value came not from the name of the framework alone, but from how the company used it to bring order to an immature program. By the end of this discussion, the central lesson should feel both practical and reassuring. Industry standards and frameworks are not there to make security feel more complicated. They are there to give organizations a structured way to think, plan, communicate, and improve. A standard usually sets expectations more formally, while a framework helps organize the broader security effort around coherent categories and repeatable management practice. Good leaders choose a model based on business need, maturity, and stakeholder expectation, then apply it through assessment, prioritization, governance, documentation, measurement, and ongoing review. They avoid shallow checklist behavior and instead use the framework to make the program more understandable and more sustainable over time. For a new learner, this is one of the most useful ideas in security management. You do not build a strong program by chasing every issue separately. You build it by using a sound structure to connect risk, controls, ownership, and improvement into a program that the business can actually run, explain, and strengthen year after year.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.